never really told anyone about this, but I guess it's been long enough that I can finally talk about it. It was the Christmas season, and I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, just old enough to feel like I could handle myself, but obviously not nearly as smart or brave as I thought I was back then. It happened at one of those massive malls, the kind with the endless stores, bright lights, and crowds everywhere. It was decorated with Christmas lights, and there were giant wreaths hanging from the ceiling. My mom and dad had taken me Christmas shopping, but at some point I got distracted by a display of toy cars in one of the department stores. I can still remember the shiny race cars under those bright store lights. They looked amazing to me back then. I thought it would just take a second to look, and then I'd go back to my parents, who were only a few aisles away. But when I finally tore myself away and looked up, they were gone. At first I didn't panic, I thought I could find them pretty easily. I walked around the toy section expecting to spot them any second, but all I saw were strangers, people rushing by with their shopping bags, busy with their own lives. I started calling out for them, trying to stay calm, but it felt like no one could hear me over the holiday music and chatter. That's when I felt the first tiny prickle of fear. I remember thinking I should ask for help, but I didn't know who to trust. Then I saw a guy in a Santa suit standing near a large Christmas tree display. He wasn't the main Santa with the big chair who had a long line of kids waiting to sit on his lap. He was just standing off to the side, kind of away from everyone else, watching people walk by. I thought, well, he's Santa, he must be safe, right? So I went up to him, tugged on his red sleeve and told him I couldn't find my mom and dad. He gave me this big smile and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. He seemed nice enough, with a white beard and glasses, just like Santa is supposed to have. He leaned down, smiled and said, "Don't worry, kiddo, I'll help you find them." He took my hand at first. I felt like everything was going to be okay. He was guiding me away from the crowds, where it was quieter, saying we were going to an office where they could announce it over the intercom. I remember thinking that made sense. I was still young enough to believe that adults always knew what they were doing. But as we walked, I started noticing how far we were getting from the main part of the mall, and I started feeling uneasy. The mall felt colder and darker the further we walked. The music and chatter from the busy areas faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above us. I tried to keep up with his pace, but he was walking faster now, his grip on my hand tightening. That's when I started to get really scared. I remember my stomach sinking, like something was really wrong. I told him maybe I should just go back to where I lost my parents, that they'd probably be looking for me there. He didn't even look at me. He just said, "Don't worry, we're almost there." His voice was different now. It didn't sound as friendly, and his hand felt cold and rough, nothing like how I thought Santa's hand would feel. I started pulling back a bit, trying to slow down, but he kept pulling me forward. My heart was pounding, and I could feel myself starting to tear up. I didn't want him to think I was scared, but everything in me was screaming that I needed to get away from this guy. Then, out of nowhere, this older woman appeared around the corner. She had a bunch of bags in her arms and looked like she was in a rush, but she stopped when she saw us. She looked at me, then looked at the man holding my hand, and I could see her expression change from confusion to something like concern. "Hey, are you okay, sweetie?" she asked me, her eyes narrowing at the man beside me. I hesitated, glancing up at him. He was staring at her and his grip loosened just a little. I didn't know what to say, but I guess she could tell something was wrong from the look on my face. She stepped closer and repeated, "Are you lost, honey?" At that moment, I felt like I could cry from relief. I nodded, and before I knew it, she had put down her bags and was reaching out to take my hand. The man let go, and I stepped back towards her, feeling safer with every inch I put between him and me. She looked him over, not breaking eye contact, and asked him, "What's going on here?" He stammered something about helping me find my parents, but he sounded so off, so fake. The old lady didn't bite for a second. She stood her ground, her hand on my shoulder, and said in this firm voice, "I think he's better off with me. I'll take him to the front desk." The guy just stood there for a second, looking between us. He started to say something, but then he glanced around, probably realizing that he was drawing attention now. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and fear that he might come back. The lady brought me to the front desk, just like she said she would, and helped me explain to the mall staff that I had lost my parents. They let me use the intercom to call for them, and within a few minutes my mom came rushing over, practically in tears, hugging me so tight I thought I might pass out. I told her about the man in the Santa suit, about how he tried to take me somewhere far from everyone else. She was horrified, and we told the mall security, but by the time they checked the area, he was long gone. I don't know if they ever found him or even looked that hard. They told my parents they'd keep an eye out for anyone matching his description, but who knows if they actually did. To this day, I think about what might have happened if that lady hadn't come along when she did. It still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. This happened last December. I work in a small tech company, and during the holiday season, things get crazy. It was December the 6th, and I stayed late trying to finish a project before the holidays. By the time I left the office, it was after midnight, and the parking lot was almost empty. The night was freezing and a cold wind was blowing. I just wanted to get home, crank the heater, and crash. I started driving, and the roads were completely deserted. I had to go down this long dark stretch of highway that cuts between two small towns with almost nothing but fields and trees on either side. There were no streetlights out there either, so it was just me, my headlights, and the pitch black road ahead. Then I saw him, a guy dressed as Santa Claus, walking around the shoulder, not even sticking his thumb out or anything, just walking like he was on some mission. I slowed down a little just to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I mean, it was late, freezing cold, and there was this guy in a full-on Santa suit, beard and all, just walking. I kept driving but couldn't shake the image. It was weird, yeah, but it was also freezing out there. I'm not normally one to pick up strangers, but this just felt different. Like maybe he was in some kind of trouble. So I turned around and pulled up next to him, rolling down my window. "Hey man, you need a ride?" He turned around and looked at me. His face was kind of hidden under the beard and hat, but he gave me this small nod and came over the passenger side. He didn't say anything, just opened the door, got in, and shut it quietly. I asked, "Where are you headed?" But he just stared straight ahead, like he hadn't heard me. I figured maybe he was tired, or maybe he'd had too much to drink at some holiday party. I shrugged it off and started driving. The silence was awkward, but I tried to brush it off. "So, busy night for Santa?" I joked, trying to break the ice. He didn't laugh, didn't even smile. He just sat there, staring out the windshield, as if I hadn't said a word. After a few minutes, I started feeling uncomfortable. I kept glancing over at him, and there was just something off. His face was sort of blank, but he was breathing heavily like he'd just ran a marathon. I could see his chest rising and falling under the suit, way faster than it should have been. And his hands. He kept flexing his fingers, clenching and unclenching them, but it looked more like twitching, like he couldn't control it. At this point, I was starting to regret picking him up. I mean, this guy hadn't said a single word, and something about him just felt way wrong. But I told myself he was probably just cold and out of it. We drove on in silence, the road stretching ahead into darkness. Then he started mumbling. At first it was low, just a quiet muttering I could barely make out over the sound of the car. I thought maybe he was talking to me, so I glanced over and said, "Sorry, what was that?" He didn't look at me. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, and his lips were moving, but he wasn't talking to me. The mumbling got louder, more intense, but I still couldn't understand a word he was saying. His voice was strained, like he was facing the words out through clenched teeth. I thought maybe he was praying or just talking to himself, but I started catching little bits and pieces, stuff that made my skin crawl. He kept repeating phrases like, "He's coming," and "no more hiding," mixed with some stuff that made no sense at all. He'd mutter a bunch of garbled words, then go dead quiet, only to start up again, louder and faster. I was just hoping he'd snap out of it at that point. Then he did something that freaked me out even more. He started slapping his own face. Not hard, but like he was trying to wake himself up. Except he kept doing it over and over. He'd slap his cheek a few times, mumble something, then slap the other side. It was so weird, so unsettling. Every time he did it, I'd flinch, my heart racing. I was almost too scared to look, but I couldn't help it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cleared my throat and tried to sound calm, though my voice was shaky. Hey, are you alright, man? Do you need help? He turned and looked at me for the first time. And his eyes. There was something wrong with them. They were wide open, too wide, like he was terrified. And he had this look of absolute panic, like he was seeing something awful that I couldn't see. He didn't answer my question. He just stared at me, and then, out of nowhere, he started to scream. It was this low, guttural scream, like he was in pain, but he wasn't moving or trying to get out of the car. He just kept screaming, his hands clenching and unclenching as he stared at me with those wide, panicked eyes. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. We were out in the middle of nowhere, no cars around, just dark fields stretching out on either side. I told him he needed to get out, that I couldn't help him, and that I was done. I was shaking, trying to keep my voice steady, but I was terrified. He stopped screaming just like that, as if someone had hit a switch. He looked at me, his expression going blank again, like none of it had even happened. I waited, my hands on the door handle, ready to get out if he tried anything. He stared at me for a few seconds, then nodded slowly, like he'd just made up his mind about something. Without saying a word, he opened the passenger door and got out. He stood there for a second, looking around like he was lost. Then he turned and started running. Just took off into the field, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there frozen watching him go. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just ran like he was trying to escape something only he could see. I waited a few minutes, staring out at the empty field where he'd vanished, half expecting him to come back or for someone else to appear out of nowhere. But nothing happened. The road was dead silent. I finally snapped out of it, put the car in gear, and floored it, heading home as fast as I could. I never saw him again, never heard anything on the news about some sad guy out in the fields. I still have no idea who he was or what was wrong with him, but the memory of his face, of those wild, panicked eyes, still haunts me. And that scream, it's something I'll never forget. I've been working as a mall center for a few years now. It's a part-time gig I pick up around the holidays to make some extra cash. Mostly it's harmless fun. You sit there in a big red suit, the beard, the whole deal, and the kids line up to tell you what they want for Christmas. Most of the time it's bikes, video games, or some new gadget they've seen on TV. It can be exhausting, but it's usually pretty uneventful. But last Christmas season something happened that stuck with me ever since. It started out as a regular shift. I was working one of the busier weekends in December, so the line of kids waiting to see Santa was endless. Parents lined up with their kids, some kids looking eager, others more shy, a few even crying. You see it all when you're dressed as Santa. And I'd been doing this so long I could practically predict how each kid would act by the time they made it to my lap. Things were normal that day until this one kid came up. He was small, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with these big brown eyes and a red sweater. His mom was standing a few feet back, but it was clear she wasn't the one who he'd come with. When he got to me, he looked up with his kind of nervous, tired expression that immediately struck me as odd for a kid his age. But I didn't think too much of it. Kids come from all kinds of backgrounds, and you never really know what's going on in their lives. "Hey there, buddy," I said, trying to keep up my usual cheerful Santa act. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he mumbled, barely meeting my eyes. "Well, nice to meet you, Daniel," I said. "What do you want Santa to bring you this year?" He hesitated, glancing around nervously before leaning in closer to me. I thought he was just shy, but then he started talking, and his voice was so low I had to lean in to hear him. At first, I didn't really understand what he was saying. He was mumbling, stumbling over his words. But as he kept going, I felt this cold chill creeping up over me, and I realized this kid wasn't talking about toys or games or anything like that. He was talking about his dad. "Sometimes," he whispered, his little voice wavering, "sometimes he gets real mad, and he yells a lot. He says stuff about my mom, like she's not doing stuff right, and he hurts her sometimes. He was looking down at his hands, which were clenched in his lap. I glanced over at the woman who he'd come with. She was looking down at her phone, oblivious. I guess she must have been a family friend or maybe even a babysitter. I felt uneasy, but I kept my voice steady. I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel. Is your mom okay? He didn't respond to that. Instead, he kept going, his voice dropping even lower. He's got these ideas. He talks about doing things sometimes. He looked up at me, eyes wide and serious. Bad things. I swallowed hard. I wasn't sure how to handle this. I mean, what do you say to a kid who's telling you stuff like this? I didn't want to scare him, so I just nodded, trying to keep calm. What kind of bad things does he talk about? I asked gently, not even sure if I wanted to know the answer. Daniel looked around again, like he was afraid someone might hear. He leaned in even closer, his breath shaky. He says he could hurt people if they make him mad enough, like if they don't listen, or if they get in his way. He says it when he thinks I can't hear. For a second I was speechless. This little kid was talking about stuff no kid should know about. And the way he was saying it, he didn't fully understand what he was describing, but I could tell he knew enough to be afraid. Just then, I noticed a man standing further back in the line, away from the moms and other kids. He was just watching us, me specifically, as I sat there with Daniel on my lap. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, with a stiff stance and dark eyes that didn't blink much. The moment our eyes met, I felt this weird jolt of tension, and something about his gaze sent chills down my spine. I turned back to Daniel, feeling more nervous by the second. Daniel, I said, doing my best to keep my voice calm. Is that your dad over there? Daniel didn't even look up. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on his shoes. Yeah, he's waiting for me. There was a pause, and then Daniel took a deep breath as if summoning some kind of courage. Can you make him stop? His voice was so quiet, so full of this strange, resigned fear that it made my heart ache. At that moment, I felt completely helpless. Here was this little kid looking up at me, asking Santa for help with something no kid should ever have to deal with, and I had no idea what to say. I wanted to tell him it would be all okay, but I couldn't lie to him. I didn't know his situation. I didn't know what this guy would do if he found out what his son had just told me. Instead, I just squeezed his shoulder and gave him a small nod. You're very brave, Daniel, I said, my voice almost a whisper. I know it's hard, but you keep being strong, okay? He nodded slowly, looking at me with a strange, sad understanding that didn't seem right for a kid his age. Then he slipped off my lap, gave me one last look, and started walking back towards the man in the line. As he reached his dad, the man put a hand on his shoulder, gripping it just a little too tightly. He leaned down, whispered something in Daniel's ear, and Daniel looked back at me, his eyes wide with fear. The man gave me this hard, menacing look that made my skin crawl. I didn't look away, even though I really wanted to. The two of them turned and walked out of the mall, and as they disappeared into the crowd, Daniel glanced back at me one last time. The look in his eyes was something I'll never forget. It was a mix of fear and desperation, like he was silently pleading with me to do something, anything to help. After they left, I sat there for a few minutes just staring after them. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I should tell someone, maybe a mall security guard, or even call the police. But what would I say? Some kid told me his dad has bad ideas? Would anyone even take me seriously? In the end, I just sat there, feeling helpless and haunted by that little boy's face, by the things he'd said. I hoped that maybe it was just a child's misunderstanding, that his dad wasn't really the kind of person he described. But deep down, I had a horrible feeling that Daniel had been telling the truth. I still think about him sometimes, especially around the holidays. I wonder what happened to him, wonder if he's okay. All I know is that was the last season I ever worked as a mall Santa. I couldn't go back after that, not with those memories.